Okay, super darn heck good. I've got all of that stuff. Yes, I did. I changed my profile back. I'm always trying to remember what new little things that have been added by the lovely folks at Facebook to make my already complicated life even more complicated. And I just love complication. Anyway, hello, good evening, or good afternoon, or good morning, depending on where in the world you are or when you're watching this. I don't know why I even bother. I should just say hi. Hi, howdy. I'm Tad. I am going to be reading some book tonight, or at least some more of a book. And before that, what is there to update people on? Everybody in the household has now had at least their second vaccination, although 4 out of the 6 of us are still in our waiting period, meaning we're not out of the woods, so to speak, yet for another couple of weeks, but we have been shot. And I'm sure there are many people who are saying, God, I hope Tad Williams gets shot. But in the sense of vaccination, at least, I have been. We are all acceptably vaccinated, and now we're just waiting. So good luck to all the rest of you out there still trying to find yours. I hope you are all doing it just for the sake of your health and to reduce the chances of you getting this nasty, nasty virus. So anyway, enough about that. What else to say? Not a whole lot, really. I'm just working. I'm working on Navigator's Children. I'm working on a proposal for another book, which at some point I will tell you about, but since it's only a proposal right now and I haven't even sent it to my publishers yet, there's just no point in talking about it because it could be yet another thing that then I spend the next 20 years of my career explaining why it's never showed up. And I don't think that's all that much an entertainment value for anybody. But anyway, so that's what I'm working on. And Deb is working on her stuff. And yeah, we're hanging in. We're shuttling animals back and forth to various vet checkups and things like that. And just life, which is now fortunately taking place in a nicer time of the year. So we're able to get outside a bit and enjoy that. And that's kind of the scoop from our house. I wish I had more to tell you. I feel like, God, how boring. But most of the time, the life of a writer is pretty flippin' boring, and I kind of do my best to make it that way because I need not just writing time, but for me, what's very important is thinking time because I tend to do my thinking before I sit down to write, sometimes for several hours, figuring out what I'm working on, figuring out what the best way to do it is rather than just starting to write and kind of guessing as I go along. Especially because of the nature of the kinds of big, complicated fantasy novels that I'm writing. And there's a great deal of interweaving of plot strands and timelines and things like that. And so it's easier for me if I can just sort of get horizontal somewhere and pop in my earbuds and make the rest of the world go away and just try different fits. And as soon as I start talking about this, it's funny. As soon as I start talking about this, there's always these little visual things that I'm doing about literally fitting things together. But that's how it feels. Not that I don't see hands in my imagination, but I do feel these things as these complicated, almost like, oh, I don't know, like one of those buckyball plastic things that expands and contracts, and it's all made up of little triangles. And, there's a name for it, but for that kind of geometric figure, but I can't remember what it is. But anyway, that's what it feels like. It feels like I'm carefully picking apart little bits and popping in other ones and seeing, okay, does that still work? No, now that doesn't connect with such and such. So I pop that part out, pop another part in, all in the head, of course. But thank God it's good for something because it sure ain't fun to look at. Anyway, so that's basically where I'm at the moment. I'm just working away, everybody in the household working away on their own separate projects or school or whatever. And the dogs and the cat doing absolutely nothing helpful except to lend us their love and support. Well, that's the dogs. Lily is not huge on lending support. She's got other things to do, like sleep. Anyway, so let me say hi to everybody before I get started here. And hello, Emily. And Emily says hello to everyone. So, and Becca, hello, Becca. And Cliff, hi, Cliff. And Jared, good evening. And Greg, a pleasure to see you too. Jeremy, good evening. Brenna, hi, Brenna. Nice to see you. Leah, hello. Tadpoles. Oh my God, what a terrible, terrifying thing. Actually, although there is some connection, as I've probably explained in the past, between my name Tad and tadpoles, because it's not my real name. My real name is Robert, but I've never used it. It was a nickname when I was small. It specifically came from my mother's love of the comic strip Pogo, which is, for those of you who don't know it, and I know many of you don't, if you are lovers of language, as I am, you owe it to yourself to go track down some old Pogo collection somewhere and read a few weeks worth of it just to get the feel of Walt Kelly's brilliant, brilliant use of language. It's wonderful. But anyway, because it takes place in a swamp, an imaginary southern swamp called the Okefenokee Swamp, well, the Okefenokee's not imaginary, but anyway, because it takes place in the South, the characters all speak this very funny circumlocuitous Southern dialect. And although it's mostly just made up out of Walt Kelly's brain. And they use a lot of Southernisms. And a Southernism is to refer to a small something, like a child, as a tad, which I believe is where tadpole comes from. Although the pole part comes from the head, like poll tax. And anyway, so when I was little, I was just the Tad, and that's where that came from. So, but it is the same usage, I think, that's involved in tadpole, meaning little small thing with a head. Anyway, so now you know, and knowing is probably not worth the battle. Josh, hi, Josh. Oh, you found the person I accidentally deleted. That would be brilliant. Hi, Kenneth. How are you? Carl, good to see you. Greetings to you. Barban, hello. Nancy, hello. Ray, good to see you too. And Kelly, good evening. Gabriel, hello. Kristen, nice to see you too. Sean, okay. All right. Sean is explaining his legal recreational marijuana. You go, Sean. Chris, good to see you. Happy Tad Reading Day to you too, and to all of us. Tim, hello, good to see you. You got your first shot. Excellent, glad to hear it. Claudia, hello. And Margaret, a pleasure. You won't be listening because you still have to finish this morning's reading. That's okay. That's the good thing about this is, except for the horror of having to watch me slowly age in front of your eyes, you know, that's the plus part of having these all recorded. I keep wanting to say video, but of course we don't use videotape anymore. But I am a child of that era, I guess, still. So Kim, another Kim. Hello, Kim. Anthony, greetings from Crete. Oh, excellent. I'd love to go to Crete someday. As a matter of fact, Deborah wants us both to go to the Greek Isles and that whole area of the Mediterranean and Aegean in general. And I've never been there. I've never been even any closer than Spain. So I would love to. No, I was in Sicily, which is also, well, it's the other. Anyway, sorry, I'm babbling. But anyway, I'd love to go to Crete someday. I'm an archaeology buff. One of the first things I ever read about was about Sir Arthur Evans and Knossos, and done a lot of reading about it, and I'm fascinated by the Minoan civilization. So one day, but while you're there, enjoy it for me. Brenna, it's a Hoberman sphere. Thank you. That's what that's called, that thing that stretches in and shrinks back up again. Medardo Landon Maza Dueñas. What a great name. So much better than Tad. Tad. My other gripe with Tad, by the way, is when I was growing up, the only kinds of, if somebody had the name Tad, the assumption was that you were like a preppy, meaning, somebody from a well-to-do private school family. You probably had been sailing since you were a kid. You probably talked like, Jim Backus as Mr. Howell on Gilligan's Island. Well, that was kind of the Tad image, which, as I mentioned, that's not where it comes from with me. It's the farthest thing from who I am and the life experience I've had. I was a California semi-hippie, then later kind of a glitter rock and roll kid. And never rich, although we did fine, thank you. We never were hungry either. Anyway, yes, Cliff. Cliff says, I heart Pogo. Yes. And so does Kim. Yay. And let me see if there's anything else that I have to tell you about. No, not really. Nothing I can think of anyway offhand. So I am going to doff the glasses. This is another complicated part of hitting this age in life, is that you not only have to have lenses, but you have to have different lenses for different lengths. It's some of you I know are probably already into that stage because it happens long before where I am now. It's kind of one of the first signs of encroaching middle age. But I'm at the point now where I'm constantly, and the brain is still sharp, but I've got so many different things and glasses and things. And when I'm wearing contact lenses, which I haven't been lately during the pandemic, but, and you have reading glasses to go with your contacts, and you have to have prescription sunglasses when you're not wearing yours. Oh, it's incredibly complicated. Then again, it beats the hell out of having anything seriously wrong. And it's just something that all of us more matured, more well-seasoned people have to put up with. So I'm not complaining. Yeah, I was kind of a little bit. I apologize. There's no need to complain. Anyway, so we are back to Shadowmarch, and we are making pretty good progress. This book has fairly large text compared to, say, the Ostenard books, which I had not recalled. But anyway, and we've just finished a section where Flint has met a rooftopper. Well, don't worry if you don't know what a rooftopper is and haven't had a chance to read that section. Suffice it to say, they are little tiny people, and they will make a reappearance, especially this particular rooftopper. But anyway, so we're now on to another section of the same chapter. She was grateful for Rose, standing beside her with the kerchief, and furious with herself for needing it. It was hard to believe how terrible a varnished wooden box could be. The funeral songs droned on and on, but she was grateful for that, too. It gave her a chance to compose herself. It seemed shameful to carry Kendrick to the tomb in a borrowed coffin, but there had been no time to prepare a proper one. In fact, Ninor had assured her the Funderling craftsman had done well simply to prepare the tomb. The true coffin, with its carved effigy, should not be hurried, he said. Would she want an imperfect likeness of her brother to gaze out at eternity, as if he were forced to hide behind a crude mask? Kendrick could be moved into the stone coffin when it was finished. Still, it seemed shameful. Despite the presence of members of the household like Rose and Moyna, a dry-eyed but somber Chavin, and even old Puzzle, hatless and dressed in black and gray motley, his hair smoothed across his head in thin strands, the royal family's bench at the front of the chapel was only half full. Bryony's stepmother, Anissa, sat a short distance away beside Marilana, arms folded protectively across her belly. Her face was hidden by a black veil, but she sobbed and snuffled loudly. At least we found something that could get her out of bed, was Bryony's bitter thought. She had not seen much of the Queen lately. It was as though Anissa had turned the Tower of Spring into a sort of fortress, covering all the windows with heavy cloths and surrounding herself with women, as a besieged monarch might surround himself with soldiers. Bryony had never entirely warmed to her stepmother, but for the first time she was truly beginning to dislike her. Your husband is imprisoned, woman, and one of his children is murdered. Even with a baby in your belly, surely you have more duties now than just to hide in that nest of yours, like a she-crow brooding on her eggs. The chorus finished at last, and Hierarch Sizel, in his finest red and silver robes, stood and took his place in front of the coffin, to begin the funeral oration. It was the sort of thing Sisal did best, showing why King Olin had chosen him to fill such an important post despite the objections of Sisal's own superiors back in Cyan, who had thought him too lukewarm in his support of the policies of the current Trigonarch. And he spoke the familiar words with apparent compassion and sincerity. As the soothing Hyrusoline litany filled the Erebor chapel, Bryony could almost let herself believe she had found one of those echoes of the past, a remnant of the days she would whisper with her brothers during services, annoying Marilana and frustrating the old mantis, Father Timoid, who knew that the children's father would never let them be scolded for a crime Olin himself deemed so insignificant. But I'm not a child now, she thought. There is nowhere for me to hide from this moment. As Sisal began to speak the words of the epitaph, the nobles dutifully repeating the significant phrases, Bryony was distracted by a fuss at her elbow. Moina was talking sharply but quietly with a young page. "What does the young fellow want?" Bryony whispered. "I come from your brother, Highness," the child told her. Held tightly around the middle by her confining garments, Bryony did her best to bend toward the boy. It made her breathless. Beric? But of course it had to be Beric. If her other brother had sent her a message, it would not be carried by a young boy with a dripping nose. "Is he well?" "He is better. He sends to say that you should not go to the crypt. The boy was nervous and couldn't remember the word. This little fellow is facing the goddess of the night after all, she thought. Are you happy now, Lord Brone? I am not a weeping girl any more. I have become a thing to scare children. The crypt? Yes, Highness. The boy nodded rapidly, but still couldn't meet her eye. He says you should not go down to the crypt until you see what he is sending to you. What is he sending? Bryony looked to Rose, staring in damp misery at the coffin on the altar. It was draped in a banner blazoned with the Eden wolf and stars, but it was no less dreadful for its proud covering. Behind her, Bryony could hear the courtiers whispering loudly, and she felt herself growing angry at their disrespect. Why are these fools talking? Rose, did you hear what the boy said? What could Beric be sending? Myself. She turned, and her heart thumped painfully in her breast. With his long black cloak only imperfectly covering the white nightdress, and his face even paler than usual, Beric might have been Kendrick himself in his winding sheet. Her twin stood in the aisle of the chapel, with a royal guardsman at each elbow, helping him to stand upright. Just getting here had clearly been an effort. His face was damp with sweat, and his eyes did not quite meet hers. Bryony levered herself upright and pushed past Moina, grateful that she was in the front of the chapel and not wedged between two rows of benches like a caravel in a too tight berth. She threw her arms around Beric as well as she could manage with her heavy clothes and confining corset, then realized everyone in the chapel must be looking at them. She leaned back a little and kissed his cheek, which was still warm from fever or effort. But, you wonderful fool, she said quietly, what are you doing here? You should be in bed. He had been stiff in her embrace. Now he stepped back, shaking off the two guardsmen who were trying to help him. What am I doing here? He asked loudly. I am a prince of the house of Eden. Did you think you would bury our brother without me? Bryony put her hand to her mouth, surprised by his tone, but even more shocked by the look of cold anger on his face. Something in her own features seemed to touch him in a way her embrace and kiss had not. His expression softened, and he sagged. One of the guardsmen took his elbow. Oh, Bryony, I am sorry. I have been so ill. It was so hard to get here. I had to stop and catch my breath every few steps, but I had to. For Kendrick. Pay no attention. My mind has been full of so many foolish things. Of course. Oh, Beric, of course, sit down. She helped him onto the bench beside her. Even seated, he did not let go of her hand, holding her fast in his damp, hot grip. Hierarch Sizel, after waiting while the courtiers reseated themselves, and with only the smallest and most tasteful look of puzzlement, resumed the eulogy. Whether we are born in time of joy or time of woe, and whether we make of our lives a wonder to all eyes or a shame before heaven, still the gods grant us only our allotted time. So said the oracle Iaris in the days of the splendor of Hyrosol, and he spoke truth. To no man is given anything certain but death, be he ever so exalted. But be he ever so low, still can his spirit be seated with the immortals in heaven. To Kernios, of the black, fruitful earth, we commend this, our beloved Kendrick Eden's mortal raiment. To Erebor of the waters we give back the blood that ran in his veins. But to Perrin of the skies we offer up his spirit, that it may be carried to heaven and the halls of the gods, as a bird is carried on the winds, until it reaches the safety of its own nest once more. May the blessings of the three be upon him, this our brother. May the blessings of the three be also upon those who must remain behind. The world will be a darker place for the light that was his and is now gone. But it will shine brightly in the halls of the gods and shall be a star in heaven. As he finished, the hierarch sprinkled a handful of earth on the coffin, then a few drops of water from a ceremonial jar. Lastly, he set a single white feather atop them. As the gathered nobles spoke the response to Sizel's words, 4 guardsmen stepped forward and slid 2 long poles through the coffin's handles, rucking the embroidered head of the Eden wolf on the covering cloth, so that its snarl seemed to turn to a look of confusion. Then they lifted the coffin and carried it to the door of the chapel. Bryony, going slowly so Beric would not fall behind, moved to her place behind the coffin. She reached out a hand and lifted the family banner so she could touch the polished wood. She wanted to say something, but could not make herself believe that the Kendrick she knew was in that box. It would be too cruel if he was, putting him down under all that stone. He loved to ride, to run. She was weeping again as the coffin was carried out of the chapel behind a ceremonial guard, with all the noble mourners falling into line behind the twins. The other residents of the palace had been waiting beside the flower-strewn path, the servants and lesser nobility who were now getting their only chance to see the casket that held the prince's remains. Many were crying and moaning as though Kendrick's death had just happened, and Bryony found herself both moved and yet somehow angered by the noise, quite out of control for a moment, so that she had to fight herself not to turn around and run back into the chapel. She turned to Beric instead and saw that he hardly seemed to notice the crowd. He was staring at the ground with clenched-jawed ferocity, using all his strength just to stay moving behind the coffin. It was too painful for Bryony to watch him, almost frightening. He looked like he was still locked in a fever dream, as though only his body had come back to join the living. She turned away from her twin, and, as her eyes swept the crowd, she glimpsed a small face watching intently from a spot on the wall. A fair-haired boy who had apparently climbed up to get a better vantage point. For a moment she was fearful for the child. He was treetop high, but he seemed as unconcerned as a squirrel. Beric had caught up again, and now he whispered in her ear, "They're all around, you know." For a moment she thought he was talking about small boys, like the one clinging to the wall. Who are? He put his fingers to his lips. Softly, softly. They do not think I know, but I do. And when I have taken up my birthright, I will make them pay for what they have done. He fell back a pace and let his gaze drop to the ground once more, his mouth set in a tight, pained smile. Please let this end soon, she prayed. Merciful Zoria, just let us put our brother into the ground and let this day end. When they reached the graveyard, the procession wound among the slanting shadows of ancient stones until it reached the mouth of the family crypt. Bryony and Barrick, Anissa, Marilana, and a few others followed the guardsmen and their burden down into the ground, leaving the rest of the nobles to stand on the grass at the door of the tomb, deserted and awkward. The graveyard was full of big folk, all of them in mourning dress. Chert felt like he was lost in a thicket of black trees. There was no sign of the boy anywhere. All he could do was wait. The funeral had almost ended. In a few moments, the royal family would come back out and the crowd would disperse. Maybe then he could find some trace of where the child had gone. Opal will never forgive me, he thought. What could have happened to him? With all these people here, could he have stumbled on his real family? Chert thought even Opal could live with that if they only knew it for certain. But it's not just Opal, he admitted to himself. I'll miss the boy too, mourn the loss of him. Fissure and Fracture listened to me, talking like it was Flint being put away in the dark instead of the prince. He's just run off somewhere is all. A hand touched his back. He turned to find the boy standing beside him. You! Where have you been? Heart racing with unexpected joy and relief, Chert surprised himself by grabbing the boy and pulling him close. It was like hugging an unwilling cat. Chert released him and looked him over. The child seemed quiet and full of something. Secrets, perhaps, but that was nothing new. Where have you been? Chert asked again. I met one of the old people. Who is that? What do you mean? But Flint did not answer. Instead, he stared past Chert at the place where the royal family had descended into the tomb. Chert turned to see that some of them had come out again. The funeral was over. You still haven't told me where you went, boy. Why is that woman looking at me? Chert swiveled until he saw the stout old woman in black and gold brocade, part of the funeral party. He almost recognized her, wondered if she might be the murdered prince's great-aunt, Marilana. She was indeed staring at the boy, but as Chert watched, she swayed a little as though she might faint. Flint quickly moved behind Chert, but he did not look fearful, only cautious. Chert turned back to see the old woman's maids steadying her, leading her back toward the inner keep. But even as she walked, the woman kept looking around as if for the boy, her face set in an odd mixture of terror and need, until the milling crowd hid her from Chert's view. Before he could make any sense out of what he had seen, a ripple passed through the crowd, a quiet murmuring. He caught at the boy's sleeve to make sure he didn't vanish again. The young prince and princess were being helped up the stairs and out of the crypt. They both looked shaken, the prince in particular so pale and hollow-eyed that he might have been one of the tomb's denizens, escaped for a moment back into the outside air. Poor Eden family, Chert thought as the twins floated past, surrounded by courtiers and servants, but somehow terribly alone, as though they were only partly in the world the rest of the castle folk shared. It was hard to believe they were the same pair he had seen riding in the hills only a few days earlier. The weight of the world, that's what they're carrying now, he thought. For the first time he could truly feel the meaning of the old phrase, the grim solidity of dirt and cold stone. It made him shiver. And that's the end of part 1. So right now we are starting part 2. Part 2, Moonlight. This king, Cleon, beloved grandchild of the Father of Waters, was troubled by what the beggar had told him, and so he swore that all the children who bore the sign of infamy should be found and then destroyed. From A Compendium of Things That Are Known, the Book of the Trigon. Chapter 13, Vanson's Charge. Hall of Pursuit. A strong man who does not sing. A singing man who does not turn, even when the door closes. From the Bonefall Oracles. I don't want to hear any more. He was tired, and his head hurt. He still felt deathly ill, felt as though he would never again be truly well. He wanted only to go back to what he had been doing, bouncing the hard leather ball against the floor that had already been pitted with age in his great-grandfather's day, and thinking about nothing. Please, Beric, I beg of you. Galen Tolley, Duke of Summerfield, was doing his best to keep impatience from his voice. It amused Beric, but it angered him too. Prince Beric, I am Prince Regent now. I am not your little cousin any longer, and you cannot treat me that way. Galen bobbed his head. Of course, Highness. Forgive my disrespect. Beric smiled. Better. Well then, tell it to me again. I have... The Duke regained his look of patience. It is simply this. Your sister has seen the envoy from Ludus again this morning. The black man, Doet. By herself? Behind closed doors? Galen colored. No, Highness, in the garden with others present. Ah. Beric bounced the ball again. It did trouble him, but he wouldn't show it and give Galen the satisfaction. So, my sister, the Princess Regent, was talking in the garden to an envoy of the man who's holding our father prisoner. Yes, but... Galen scowled and turned to Avon Brone. Prince Beric does not want to understand me, Brone. You explain. The mountainous Lord Constable shrugged, a motion that looked as if it might start an avalanche. She appears to enjoy the man's company. She listens very closely to what he has to say. While you were ill, he had a long audience with her, Highness, said Galen. She ignored everyone else who was present. Ignored, thought Beric. Through all the disturbing images that had not entirely left his head, through weariness and the strands of fever that still draped him like cobwebs, it was a word whose meaning he understood immediately. She is paying more attention to him than to you? Is that what you mean, Galen? No. It seems to me that you are trying to drive a wedge between my sister and myself. Beric flung the leather ball down against the floor. It hit on the edge of a flagstone, and went bouncing across the room. Two young pages dove out of the way as one of the larger dogs scrambled after it, then chased it into a corner behind a chest and growled in excited frustration. But my sister and myself are almost the same thing, Duke Galen. That is what you must know. You wrong me, Highness. Galen turned to Brone, but the big man was watching the dog rooting behind the chest, making it clear that he wanted no responsibility for the Duke's little embassy. We are in a terrible time. We need to be strong. All the houses of Southmarch must stand together. Eddens, Tolleys, all of us. I know that. But neither should the common people begin to whisper of dalliances between your sister and your father's kidnappers. You go too far. Beric was angry, but it was a distant fury, like lightning over far hills. Leave this room now, and I will forgive your clumsy tongue, Galen. But be careful. If you say such things in front of my sister, you may find yourself fighting for honor, and she will not ask for a champion. She will fight you herself." "By the gods, is this whole family mad?" the Duke cried, but Brone already had Galen Tully's shoulder and was steering him toward the door, whispering words of calm in his ear. The Lord Constable gave Beric an odd look as he urged Galen out, something that could equally have been surprised approval or disdain imperfectly masked. Beric did not feel strong enough to try to make sense of it all. In the 3 days he had been out of bed, through the ghastly funeral, and the equally drawn-out and exhausting ceremony in the castle's huge incense-choked trigonate temple that had conferred the regency on both Bryony and himself, he had never felt entirely well. That terrible fever had swept through him like a wildfire through a forest glade. Fundamental things were gone, roots and branches, and they would take time to grow back. At the same time, the fever itself seemed to have left behind unfamiliar spores, seeds of new ideas which he could feel quickening inside him, waiting to hatch. "What will I become?" he wondered, staring at his bent left hand. "I was already a monster, already a target for scorn, haunted by those terrible dreams, by father's legacy. Am I a target for treachery now as well?" These new thoughts would not go away. Feelings of distrust that scratched away at him at all hours, sleeping and waking like rats in the walls. He had prayed and prayed, but the gods did not seem to care enough to relieve his misery. Should I be listening to Galen more carefully about this? But Beric did not trust his cousin at all. Everyone knew that Galen was ambitious, although he was by no means the worst of his family. His brothers, sly Caradon and the dangerously reckless Hendon, made the Duke of Summerfield seem almost maiden-shy by comparison. In fact, Beric did not trust any of the Southmarch nobles, not Brone, not Tyne Aldrich of Blueshore, not even the old Castellan, Ninor, no matter how valuable a servant any of them had been to his father. He trusted nobody but his sister, and now Galen's words had begun to eat away at that bond, too. Beric stood up, so full of rage and unhappiness that even the dog shied away. His 2 pages waited, solemn-faced, watching him as small animals watch a larger one who might be hungry. He had shouted at them more than a few times since dragging himself out of his fever bed, and had struck both of them at least once. "I must dress now," he said, trying to keep his voice level. The council was meeting in an hour. Perhaps he should ask Bryony straight out. Excuse me. Knew that was coming. The council was meeting in an hour. Perhaps he should ask Bryony straight out what her business was with the Dark Man, the envoy. The memory of Dowet's lean brown face and superior smile sent a little shudder of unease up Beric's spine. It was so much like something from the fever dreams, those shadowy, heartless creatures that pursued him. But waking life had also been nightmarish since then. It was all he could do to remind himself that he was awake, that the walls were solid, that eyes did not watch him from every corner. "I almost told Bryony about father," he realized. That was one thing he must never, never do. It could be the end of any happiness either of them would ever have together. "I am waiting, curse it!" The pages had been lifting his dark fur-trimmed gown out of the chest. Now they hurried toward him, awkward beneath the weight, bearing the heavy thing like the body of a dead foe. What did Bryony want with that envoy? And more importantly, why hadn't she told him, her brother? He couldn't help remembering that she had seemed quite prepared to take the regency without him, to leave him alone in his bed of pain. No. He forced the thoughts away. But they did not go far. Like starving beggars rebuffed, they moved only out of immediate reach. No, not Bryony. If there is anyone I can trust, it is Bryony. His knees were shaking as the two young pages stood on their toes to drape the gown across his shoulders. He did not need to see these boys' faces. He knew they were looking at each other. He knew they thought something was wrong with him. Am I still fevered? He wondered. Or is this the thing that Father spoke of? Is this the true beginning of it? For a moment he was back in the shadowed passages of his illness, looking down a great distance into red-shot darkness. He could see no way out. Sister Uta's long face showed amusement, but concern as well, and she spoke carefully. I think it is a very bold idea, Highness. But not a good one. Is that what you're saying? Bryony fidgeted. So many things were moving inside her these days, a torrent of feeling and need, and sometimes even, well, it felt like strength, the kind that she had been asked to hide over and over again. All of these competing forces yanked at her limbs and thoughts as though she were on puppet strings. You think I am asking for trouble. You want me not to do it. You are the Princess Regent now, said Uta. You will do as you see fit. But this is a disturbed time. The waters are roiled and muddy. Is it really the time for the mistress of the nation to wear what everyone will think of as a man's garments? Is it the time? Bryony clapped her hands together in frustration. If not now, when? Everything is changing. Only a week ago, Kendrick was about to send me to marry the bandit of Irisol. Now I rule in Southmarch. With your brother? With my brother, yes. My twin. We can do whatever we want to do. Whatever we think is right. First, said Uta, remember that Beric is your twin, but he is not you. Are you saying he will be angry with me for dressing as I want to, wearing sensible, sturdy clothes instead of the frills of an empty-headed creature who is meant only to be pleasing to the eye? I am saying nothing except that your brother, too, has seen the world he knows turned upside down. And so have all the people of the country. It has not just been a few days of change, Princess Bryony. A year ago, at the autumn harvest, your father was on the throne, and the gods seemed happy. Now all has changed. Remember that. There is a dark, cold winter coming. There is already snow in the high hills. People will huddle around their fires and listen to the wind whistling in the thatch and wonder what is coming next. Their king is imprisoned. The king's heir is dead, murdered, and no one can say why. Do you think during those dark, cold nights they will be saying, thanks to the gods that we have two children on the throne now who are not afraid to turn all the old ways upside down? Bryony stared at the Zorian sister's beautiful, austere face. What I would not give to look like her, Bryony thought. Wise, so wise and calm. No one would doubt me then. Instead, I look like a milkmaid most of the time, red-faced and sweaty. I came to you for advice, didn't I? Uta made a graceful little shrug. You came for your lesson. Thank you, sister. I will think about what you've said. They had scarcely gone back to reading Claymon's The History of Ion and Its Nations when someone knocked quietly at the door. Princess Bryony, called Rose Trelling from the corridor. Highness, it is nearly time for you to see your council. Bryony got up and gave Uta a kiss on her cool cheek before going out to her waiting maids. There wasn't room for them to walk three abreast in the narrow passageway, so Rose and Moina dropped behind her. Bryony could hear the sides of their skirts brushing the walls. Moina Hartsbrook cleared her throat. That man says he would be honored if he could find you in the garden again tomorrow. Bryony couldn't help but smile at the girl's disapproving tone. By that man, you mean Lord Dowett? Yes, Highness. They all walked on in silence for a while, but Bryony could sense Moyna trying to work up the courage to speak again. Princess, she said at last, forgive me, but why do you see him? He is an enemy of the kingdom. And so are many foreign envoys. Count Evander of Cyan, and the old wheezing fellow from Cessio who smells like horse dung. You don't think those are our friends, do you? Surely you remember that fat pig Angelos, the envoy from Geelong, who smiled at me every day and fawned over Kendrick, until we woke up one morning and found that his master, King Hesper, had sold father to Hyrasol. I would have killed Angelos myself if he hadn't already made the excuse of a hunting trip and slipped away back to Geelong. But until we catch them doing something wrong, we put up with them. That's called statecraft. But is that really why you talk to him? Moyna was being stubborn. She ignored Rose's elbow, bumping her ribs. Just for statecraft? Are you asking if I spend time with him because I find him handsome? Moyna blushed and looked down. Bryony's other attendant was also having trouble meeting her eyes. I don't like him either, Rose confessed. I'm not planning to marry him, if that's what you're wondering. Highness! Her ladies-in-waiting were shocked. Of course not. Yes, he is handsome, but he is almost my father's age, don't forget. I'm interested in what he has to say about the many places he has seen. The southern continent where he was born and its deserts, or old Hyrasol with all its ruins. I have not had much chance to see other places, you know. Her maids looked at her with the expressions of young women who associated journeying in foreign lands with little beside hardship and possible ravishment. She knew they would never understand her longing to learn of things beyond this damp, dark old castle. But I am even more interested in what Dowett has to say about Shazo, of course, who, you may remember, is in chains because he seems to have killed my brother. Is it acceptable to the two of you that I should try to understand the reasons why Prince Kendrick was murdered? Rose and Moyna were both caught up in sputtering apologies, but Bryony knew she had not been entirely honest. There was more to her feelings about Dowett than simply admiration for his wide experience, although she was not exactly sure what those feelings were. She was no mere girl, she told herself, to fawn over a loathsome face, but something about the man truly had caught her attention, and she considered him more than she should, wondered what he thought both of her and her court. He would have carried me off to Ludus without a second thought, she reminded herself. That is the kind of man he is. If Kendrick had announced it a day earlier, I would be halfway to Hyrasol by now, on my way to meet my new husband, the Lord Protector. It suddenly occurred to her that since she felt certain Kendrick had, in the end, decided to give her to Ludus for the greater good of Southmarch, the Prince Regent's death had occurred at the last possible moment to prevent that from happening. The idea was so obvious and so surprising that she stopped in the middle of the hallway, and her two ladies bumped into her from behind. It took a moment before they were all sorted out and moving again, but now Bryony wished she did not have to go to the council chamber. This strange new thought made everything look different, as a cloud passing in front of the sun turned a bright day into sudden twilight. But who would be so anxious to stop Kendrick sending me away? And where would Shazo fit in such a conspiracy? Or had it been arranged not to keep Bryony herself in Southmarch, but by someone who wished to take the throne? But even if it was someone in the family with a blood claim, someone like Galen Tully or Rorik, There are still two better claims ahead of any of them, Beric's and mine. They would have to kill us too. No, there are more than two claims ahead of both Galen and Rorik, Bryony remembered. There are three. There is also the child in Anissa's belly. And, of course, that infant would be the heir to the throne if he or she was born brotherless and sisterless into the world. Anissa? Bryony suddenly did not want to think about such things any more. She had never much cared for her stepmother, but surely no woman would murder an entire innocent family for the sake of an unborn child. A child who might not even live. Surely not. But it was disturbingly hard to clear away such suspicions once they had begun to take root. Wasn't Anissa's family in Devonus related in some way to King Hesper of Geelong, the one who sold Bryony's father to Hyrosol in the first place? Galen, Rorik Longarin, her father's wife. She could not think of any of them now without suspicion. This is what murder does, she realized. She had reached the door of the council chamber and now waited to be announced. Beric was slouched in one of the two tall chairs at the head of the table, arms folded tightly across his chest, as though he were cold. The face framed in the collar of black fur, even more pale than usual. It does not make one phantom only, she thought. It makes hundreds. Once these halls were full of people I knew, even though I might not have liked them all. Now the house is crowded with demons and ghosts. Wait, and I will call for you, the message from Avon Brone commanded. Even without the Edenwolf and stars and Brone's own sigil, both stamped in wax at the bottom, the Lord Constable's thick black pen strokes would have been unmistakable. Ferris Vanson waited in his dress cloak just inside the doorway to the council chamber, between two of his guardsmen. Two more guards waited out in the hall with the man they would present to the councillors. The council room, known as the Oak Chamber, for the massive wooden table at its center, was an old room that had once been the castle treasury in the dangerous days of the marauding grey companies, a large but windowless space with only two doors, nested in the maze of corridors behind the throne hall. The captain of the Royal Guard had never much liked the stark, stony room. It was the kind of place built for last stands, for the dreadful heroics of defeat and disaster. The guard captain had been furious at first that Lord Brone should treat their news so offhandedly, ordering it held until the end of a long council session full of far more trivial matters. But as first 1 hour passed, then another, Vanson had come to believe he understood Brone's thinking. Many days had passed since Prince Kendrick's death, a killing still unexplained as far as most of the people of Southmarch were concerned, even if the murderer himself had been captured. The business of the land had been almost uniformly ignored since then, and many things had already waited in pressing need of answer before the Prince Regent died. If Vanson had been allowed to present his own news first, it was possible that none of this other business would have had its audience. So he waited, but it was not easy. He let his eye rove across the dozen noblemen who made up today's council, playing a game of anticipating an attack on the royal twins, first by this one, then by that, and trying to decide how he would counter it. The nobles looked bored, Vanson thought. They didn't seem to realize that after the recent events, boredom was a privilege, perhaps even a luxury no one could afford. Ferris also thought young Prince Beric still appeared very ill, although perhaps the boy was just careworn. Whatever the cause, Beric was certainly not paying the closest attention to the business of the kingdom. As case after case came up before them, the rents on royal lands in need of attention, official embassies of grief and support from Teleno, Sessio, and Perical to be heard, important property disputes that had come up from the assize courts or the temple courts needing a final decision, the young prince barely seemed to attend the speakers. In most cases, he simply waited for Bryony to speak, then nodded his head in agreement, all the while rubbing the crippled arm that he held in his lap like a pet dog. Only a question from Lord Ninor, the Castellan, seemed to awaken the boy from his lethargy at last, and kindle a light in his eye. Ninor wanted to know how much longer the Hierosoline envoy Dawet, Ninor wanted to know how much longer the Hierosoline envoy Dawet Dan Far would be with them, since the household purse had made allotment for only a fortnight's stay. But, although he was clearly interested, Beric became, if anything, even more silent and unmoving as Bryony answered the question. The princess said that they could not, of course, hurry a reply to the man who held her father's safety in his hands, especially at so troubled a time. She seemed almost as distracted as her brother. Ferris Vanson thought that Beric did not seem to like her answer much, but the prince made no spoken objection, and Ninor was left to go grumbling off to rearrange the household finances. The princess and her brother dispatched several dozen such questions over the course of 2 hours. The gathered nobles of the council offered suggestions, and on some occasions dissenting opinions as well, but mostly they seemed to be watching the twins at their new task, watching them and judging them. Galen of Summerfield made none of his usual objections, and in fact seemed to be as absorbed by his own thoughts as the prince and princess were by theirs. When the subject of the envoy Dawet came up, it seemed Galen might say something, but the moment passed, and the handsome duke resumed picking at the leg of the council table with a small ceremonial dagger, barely hiding what was obviously some great frustration, although Ferris Vanson had no idea what its cause might be. For the first time, Vanson could see Summerfield's duke for what he really was, despite all his power and wealth. A man younger than Vanson himself, and one with less training in silence and patience as well. It must have been hard for him, with that drunken blowhard of a father. Nobody outside Summerfield Court missed old Duke Lyndon very much, and Vanson couldn't help guessing that there probably weren't many people in his duchy who missed him either. The afternoon wore on, bringing nothing more interesting than reports of a sharp increase in the number of strange creatures that seemed to be coming from across the shadow line. Something with spines and teeth had badly injured some children near Red Tree, and a man had been killed by a goat with black horns and no eyes, which the locals had promptly captured, killed, and burned. But most of the reports were of creatures that seemed harmless, despite their strangeness, many of them crippled or dying, as though they had not been prepared for the world on this side of the unseen barrier. At last, even the novelty of these tales began to fade. Some of the council members began to ignore the proceedings and talk openly among themselves, despite sharp looks from Brone. Vanson was intrigued to see that the Lord Constable seemed also to have taken up the role of First Minister, a position unfilled since the old Duke of Summerfield's death a year earlier. He wondered if this was part of the reason for the young Duke's disgruntlement. So many things are out of joint since the king went away, Vanson thought. And now, if it pleases you, Highnesses, Avon Brone announced after a long dispute over the construction of a new trigonate temple had left most of the table yawning, there is some important business that we have saved until last. Several of the nobles, slumped and weary, actually straightened up, their attention finally caught. Vanson was about to fetch the witness when Brone surprised him by turning his back on him and summoning in two people Vanson had never even seen, a round-eyed man and a young girl. The man was bald as a turtle, although otherwise he seemed of healthy middle years, and even the girl was odd to look upon. She seemed to have plucked out her eyebrows entirely, as in the style of 100 years before, and her hairline began far up her forehead. She wore a skirt and shawl that mostly hid her form, but the man certainly had the bulging chest and long muscled arms typical of his kind. Skimmers, thought Vanson. Hundreds of the water-loving folk lived within the castle walls, and even though they generally stuck to their own kind and places, Vanson had encountered them often. But seeing them in the highest council chamber did surprise him, especially because he had thought that his own news would be asked for next. "Highnesses," Avon Brown declared, "this is the fisherman Turley Longfingers and his daughter. They have something they wish to tell you." Beric stirred. "What is this? The entertainment? Have we put old Puzzle out to graze at last and found some new talents?" Bryony gave her brother a look of irritation. "The prince is tired, but he's right about one thing. This is unusual. Lord Brone, it feels like a bit of mummery, saved till last." "Not last, I'm afraid," responded the Lord Constable. "There will be more. But forgive the surprise. I did not know whether they would come forth and tell this story until just before the council came to the table. I've been chasing down the rumor for days." "Very well." Bryony turned to the fisherman, who was squeezing an already shapeless hood or hat in the claw-like hands that must have given him his name. "He said your name is Turley?" The man swallowed. Vanson wondered what could make one of the normally imperturbable skimmers, folk who routinely swam with sharks and killed them with knives when it was needful, look so harrowed. "Turley? Yes," he said in a thick voice. "It is that, my queen." "I'm not a queen, and my brother isn't a king. The real king is our father, and he still lives, thank all the gods." She looked at him closely. "I have heard that among yourselves you skimmers don't use canoric names." Turley's eyes widened. They had very little white around the edges. We do have our own talk, Majesty, that's true." "Well, if you would prefer to use a name like that, you may." He looked for a moment as though he might actually bolt the room, but at last shook his gleaming head. "Prefer not, Majesty. Close held our names untuck. But no harm done to tell you of our clan. Back on Sunset Tide, we are called." And actually, I'm going to stop there because we're already 3 minutes after, and there is no stopping point for several pages here in this section. So I'm going to wrap it up there with Turley Longfingers and his daughter, just preparing to tell a strange story that, of course, will have interest to those following the tale. Anyway, so with that, I say thank you so much for joining me, whether you were here tonight or watching this on a recording somewhere. And again, to mention, these readings are always available on my social media, Facebook and Twitter, on tadwilliams.com, and also on YouTube. So that is all there if you want it. And since we're already a few minutes past, I will make a short goodbye tonight and just say how much of a pleasure it is to share some time with you all. I hope you all continue well, and I will see you next Friday. No, sorry, next Sunday. Hello, brain, slowing down. Click, 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 click. Something's dragging. I will see you next Sunday when I will continue, and we will get this equivalent of a courtroom scene and find out exactly what's going on. So, good night. Lovely to spend time with you. See you real soon. Peace.